So today's lab is about how different things vary. And I think it's pretty obvious at this point that everything, like pretty much every living creature on our planet, has variations, even if you don't see them, right? So we're gonna measure some of those variations and just kind of see what that looks like. And then later on, we're gonna talk more about what kind of characteristics would give us those types of variations, like what genetics would give us the variations. So we're gonna look in particular at like 3 different things. So remember what we talked about before, so you understand this lab, is that natural selection really works on variations that are already present. That will be a test question. I'm gonna keep coming back to it. Like, the variations don't suddenly arise because like a need is there. The variations are already there in the population. And when the need is there, then those get selected for. And that's how natural selection really, truly operates. So in some sense, this is what we term adaptations, okay? Sometimes a variation can become an adaptation as the environment changes. So we're gonna do some measuring today. We're gonna look at leaves, beans, and human hands, okay? So what you'll do when you get down to lab is you're gonna measure a number of items. Let me just show you how to measure, and then we'll kind of roll down there and do that. Doesn't matter really where you start when we get down to lab. You're gonna need to measure your hand. Every single person needs to do this because otherwise I'm not gonna have enough data. So to measure your hand, we're gonna stretch it out as far as it can go, and we wanna measure from pinky tip to thumb tip at the widest part there. So it's easiest if you just put your hand on top of the ruler like so, like in the picture, and then measure it out like how far it is, okay? For this one that we're measuring, you're measuring in centimeters. So be careful, check and make sure you know what the measurement scale is. This is gonna be in centimeters or these numbers aren't gonna match up. So you'll pretend I'm measuring this person's hand right here in the picture. Remember how we measure in centimeters? This is a very small hand here. So in centimeters, that's the big numbers here, right? There's 10 millimeters in a single centimeter. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. This one's at 4.5, 4.6 centimeters, okay. You can go ahead and round that on this one because our numbers are gonna be whole here. So if it's at 4.6, I'd just go ahead and say 5 centimeters, right? Everybody see how to do that? If it was, say, right around in there, I might say 4 centimeters. So just kind of round this to the nearest centimeter for us down here. And then what I'd like you to do while we're down in the lab is just write that number down here for yourself, because when we get back up here to the room, I'm going to give you a bunch more data so we can actually make a graph. So you're just gonna write your value here, okay? And if your partner's working with you, both of you do it, okay? Get your numbers written down, write yours here, and then when we get back to the room, we'll give you some more data, okay? Like I said, it doesn't matter where you start. You could start with your hand. You could also start with the yew needles that we have. We've got some coniferous twigs down there. You don't need a lot of these. You only need to measure 10 leaves, okay? So don't sit down there and measure 100 little leaves, okay? You're gonna measure 10. And they're gonna look kind of like this. Pull them off. Make sure you've got a whole leaf. Don't break off a half a leaf and measure it. There's no point in that. We're measuring these though in millimeters, so be careful there, okay? Not centimeters. So let's say I'm measuring the length of the word length here, okay, in millimeters. So that would be 10 would be that first big line there. 11, 12, 13, 14 would be to right there. From there to there is 14. You see that? So you're measuring the little lines. That's millimeters. So each big number is 10. So that'd be 20 something, 30 something. Okay, so we're gonna be able to put marks down here. So this little box here for checks is just to help you tally. So you might be like, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, I got 1 over here. And when you're done, you'll count up the total, like I got 5 there, I got 1 here, something like that, okay? So this is just, I don't care if you write anything here, it's just to keep track. What we really want is the number of leaves that are this length, okay? And if you find some that are bigger, you can make yourself a little bit more out here if you need to, okay? Adjust those numbers how you need to. All right, the seeds. We're also gonna measure length in seeds. You have beans down there. You can put them back when you're done. The needles we can throw in the trash when we're done. You're gonna measure 20 beans. So don't measure 50 of these. Pick out 20, and you're measuring from, this ruler's kind of in the wrong spot here, from end of bean to end of, that's inches, sorry, end of bean to end of bean. So right there I've got, this is once again in millimeters, I would have 20, looks like I'd have 21 millimeters on that bean right there, because it's one line past the two. So I'd have 21. So I'd make a mark over here on 21, and when I'm done, I would tally all those up down below. Pretty easy stuff, okay? If you and your partner want to work together on this, it's cool. The only one you have to have on your own is your hand size. Everybody needs to do a hand size. And remember, that's from thumb tip to pinky tip. So stretch your hand out, see how big your palm is. All right, on the back of that, we've got a bunch of questions that we'll talk about after we get done. Okay, let's head on down to lab. Okay, so we came down to lab and we measured out some seeds against a ruler here. Okay, so we did, I think, 20 seeds. And then, to see if there's variation, you can already see there's some different sizes there. Then we also did needles off of this little yew tree. So we pulled, hard to do with one hand, needles off, and then we made measurements of those with a ruler. And then the last thing that we did, of course, was to measure our hands, the length of our hands in centimeters, okay? So here's our data for the hand size, and you're gonna wanna copy this down because you're gonna need it. This is all the data from last year, plus the data from my first class this year, all added together. So you can see already that we don't really have enough data to have an appropriate sample size. And that's an important thing in science, is that if you wanna run an experiment, you need to have enough data to see if what the correlations you're drawing are actually real, or if you're just getting a small sample of the population. And this is really just not enough students to do that. But I mean, you can already see we're missing some. There's very likely some students would have a hand size here, probably some more out here. Definitely we would want more data, but this should be enough that we can actually graph this out. Okay, and we're gonna do that here in a second. So have that data down there, number of hands at different sizes. Let's do number of, or leaf length. All I care about is the number of leaves you have. Were your leaves all longer than these, what I had up here? No? Did anybody have kind of good data that fit in here? Kendra, did you have some? Would you mind reading us your data, just the number of leaves at each one?
Yeah. So 17,
one, okay.
and one again for 18.
Okay.
19 and 1. 24, 25, 26.
Okay.
27, 1, 29, 2, and 34.
Okay. So already we can see we don't really have enough data. It would be really nice to have more data than that to fill this out. But you can see already there's some variation, right? Like there's almost, it's kind of interesting, like there's a bunch of leaves in this size and a bunch of leaves kind of up in this size right here. And then there's kind of a depression right here. And it would be interesting to get more data to see if that continues. But you can definitely see, without a doubt, that there's different sizes in terms of the leaves. Like that shouldn't really surprise anybody, I hope. Okay. How about the beans? Does anybody have bean data that fit on their table here good? Yeah. You want to read me yours again? You had good data last time.
Yeah.
Let's do that again.
11, 1, 14, 4, 15, 3, 16, 1, 17, 5, 18, 1, 19, 3, 21, and 21, 1.
Okay. So once again, we can see that there's definitely a range of bean sizes here. Okay. With the majority of them sort of falling right in this range right here, and then the graph, if we were graphing it, would kind of taper off this way and taper off this way. Okay. Keep that in mind, because later on we're going to be doing some activities where we actually make all these graphs. Okay. So today, let's look at the questions here. Let's describe some of the variation that we saw in some of these things. So let's glance first at the hand size. Okay. There was a lot of variation in hand size, wasn't there? Yeah. So, and I can just say that, right? There was a lot of variation. And if I were gonna pick a spot where I had most of my hands, it would probably be between 19 to 22. Somewhere between 19 to 22 was where most hands were, in that 19 to 22 millimeter or centimeter range, okay? Keep in mind that, like, there's outliers. There's some that are much bigger, there's some that are much smaller, and that's gonna be important to what we talk about. But there was a core kind of in here where they were at about that same size. Let's look at leaf size now. So on leaf size, you guys had, once again, not quite enough data to really do this appropriately, but you should be able to see it here. In terms of leaf size, we sort of had two clusters, right? Okay, one that was up here in the 17 to 19 range, 17 to 19 millimeters. And then one that was over here in the like 24 to 30 range. So there was sort of a depression in our data here. Okay, we will see what that looks like later on when we talk more about this. But this would actually create what's called a bimodal graph, and it tells us something about populations. When we see this, it tells us something really specific. I'm doubting that this is really how the data would appear if we looked at more leaves. But it's just kind of fun to talk about it like this because it did come out that way, okay? All right, so let's look at some characteristics that we might have examined. That was just sort of one small, oh, we missed seed size, didn't we? Let's do seed size. So seed size had a nice distribution. Most of the range was between 14 to about 21 millimeters is about what the seed size was. Okay, it was kind of a range there. This probably would give us a fairly bell-shaped curve if we graphed it. Okay. Okay, let's look at some other examples. In the hands, we examined hand size. What other characteristics about the hand do you think might vary? Rather than just size, what else could we look at? Oh gosh, there's a million differences. If you put your hand up there by mine, what would you see that was different? How about the obvious one? All of our hands are going to be very different, or at least slightly different skin colors. Okay. We could look at finger length. We could look at the lines in the palm of our hand. Right? Fingerprints are all unique. You guys know that. So all these things are different variations that exist in our hands. Right? Lots of different variations. But I think probably the most noticeable one for humans would be that we would see that our skin tones are all slightly different. Okay? There'd be a very big range of that. And that's not surprising because skin color is a polygenic characteristic, which is what causes that variation. There's more than one gene involved in it. It's not an either or. You're not a tall bean plant or a short bean plant. There's a huge range, okay? So how about the leaves? If we didn't look at the length, what's something else we could look at? Anything else about the leaf? How about like the width? That's an obvious one, right? We could look at the color. We could look at the curvature. We could look at all sorts of different characteristics about a leaf. The length of it is just one characteristic that we might look at and pick out. How about the seeds? We did the size, which really the length. What else could we measure or look at about the seeds? We could do width again, couldn't we? We could do mass. That would be an interesting one. It might be related to size. We could even, once again, we could do color, right? That might be an easy one to do. Compare the colors of the seeds. Were they all exactly the same, or was some variation there? Okay. We could do thickness of seed coat, right? That's probably an even better one. the point is that it doesn't matter really what we look at in an organism. There's variation. There's differences there. Okay, and we could find more if we even looked harder. Okay, let's look at some of the questions here. How wide do most of the hand spreads measure? Well, let's look at our numbers for hand spread here. Hand spreads, we already said between 19 to about 22 is where most of our hand spreads fall. So we can just write that down again. We already came up with that. Between 19 to 22, and this was centimeters that we measured hand spreads in. So 19 to 22 is where we saw the majority of our hands falling. Okay. In which width range are the fewest hand spreads? Let's take a look here. It would appear that if we are looking at anywhere from, say, 24 to 28, or 13 to, say, like 16, so like 13 to 16 centimeters is 1, right? And then over here, looking at from like 26 and on up, let's say 28, but all the way on up. Notice how those are both sides, both the outside edges of our data. Do you see that? That's very telling that things diminish out here and get bigger in the middle here. That's a very telling thing. Okay, now we need to do a graph. So we're gonna work on that here for a second. I'll give you some graph paper. Let me show you what you're gonna be graphing here. You're going to be graphing out these numbers that we got right here. So I'll leave this up on the board for you to look at. If you've got it written down, it should be pretty easy. You can flip back and forth. And what we want to do, let me see if I can, there we go. We're going to set up a graph on our papers here. I'll show you an example of that here in just a sec. So we've got a graph laid out here. We have hand spread in centimeters across the bottom, and we're going, every centimeter skipping a line to give us enough room all the way up to 28 there. And then we want every line from 0 all the way up to 25 for the number of hands. So number of hands, hand spread. And now we're just gonna start graphing our data. So there's my data. And I'm just going to go, okay, I've got one hand at 14. So I find 14 and I go right on up to one hand, dot. I've got two hands at 15. 1, 2, dot. And when I'm done, I'm going to connect the dots. Okay? Okay, while you guys are finishing that up, I just want to talk about the graph a little bit and how it relates to this last question here, okay? And you can finish your graph up as you go in here. But what's the general shape of the graph? So this type shaped graph, even though it comes to a point at the top, is traditionally what we refer to as like a bell-shaped graph. If we had more data, we would see this thing spread out more and curve up to a nice rounded curve up there, and it would look like a bell shape, okay? So you can even write that down. It's like a bell curve, okay? What does the graph tell us about the hand spreads in our class? So first things first, is there variation in hand spreads? 100% yes, right? Like there's definitely variation in the hand spreads. But let me ask you this. Is there a group of one size hands and a group of another size hands? Or is there like an average hand size with some outliers? See how that's a different scenario? In this graph, there is an average size that is the most common, okay? So I'm gonna say here that yes, there is variation in hand size. Okay. There is Okay, so there's an average range with some hands that fall outside of that range. Okay, there's definitely variation there, and there's an average range with some hands that are falling either as larger or smaller than the average, but there's definitely an average here. Okay, the rest of your questions here are pretty straightforward. You can just look through at your numbers here. What was the most common of each of these things, right? Same thing here. Let's talk about advantages though, because this one's a little trickier. And I want to talk about the hand spread in particular first, okay? So in terms of the hand spread, do you think, like, what's the advantage to having a certain sized hand? Is there an advantage? For a basketball player, sure, right? But like, think about a human. What do you use your hands for? Virtually everything, right? Like, they're really important tools. So do you think that there would be a hand size at some point that would be just too small? There would be a serious disadvantage. Like, think to extremes. So yeah, there's a certain size hand that's not going to be very good, very useful. But what about, how about like large hand size? What if I had like a balloon hand, like this gigantic hand? I would be unable to manipulate small objects, right? I couldn't write with a pencil if I had this gigantic hand to try and like write with. It would be really hard. And so for humans, there is an optimal hand size. And there's some variation, right? But if you get variation that's too far outside of that range in either direction, it becomes a serious disadvantage. Okay, so for humans, okay, for instance, having a larger hand spread, it might be useful in terms of like strength maybe, like, right? But really, what I want you to understand is that, like, right now, the human hand is in this range. And the reason is because it's optimal. If it was too big, we couldn't do some of the tasks that we need to do. So really, the size of our hand is kind of more determined based on our tool use, right? That's what's really constraining whether we have bigger or smaller hands, is how we use them. Okay. Think about the size of a whale flipper, right? On a whale, the flipper, it needs to be a certain size because it's going through the water, not because it's using tools. Okay. Okay, how about longer tree leaves? How could that maybe be a useful thing? What do tree leaves do? How about maybe more sunlight for photosynthesis, right? Collect more sun. Like, that's the purpose of a leaf, is to collect the sunlight. Well, what about a seed? Maybe having a bigger seed versus a smaller seed. Maybe it's better able to germinate if it's larger. But one thing I want you to take away from this is that we don't have gigantic seeds in bean plants. Right? And there's a cost benefit and thing that we can do with that. It's costly to make a big seed. Even if it survives better, it's hugely wasteful. So the seed is just big enough to serve the purpose of being able to sprout and survive. If it's too small, it can't. So that's why you don't see just gigantic, ridiculously sized seeds, right? And you can look at your data to fill the rest of these out here, okay? Right. But I want to turn last thing really quick back to this graph. There's a lot of issues with the study that we did, okay? So, and I just wanted to point out a few of them because it is kind of interesting, right? First of all, think about how we measured this. We didn't measure enough hands to really get good data. And secondly, how about you guys and your hand size? Is it staying the same right now? No, we measured a bunch of teenagers' hands, which means you're not adults, which means your hand size is probably going to still increase some as you grow. right? So that's probably skewing our study a little bit. How about this one? Do you think there's differences between hands size for females versus males? Do you think that's the case? Oh yeah. In biology, that's known as sexual dimorphism. So if we were to really graph this out among adults in the population of humans, I can almost guarantee you this would turn up to be a bimodal graph. You would have a bump for males and a bump for females. Okay, and they would overlap some, but there'd be a slight difference there. Okay, and why is that? There could be a lot of reasons. I'm not a hand scientist. I don't know for sure, but you know, we talked about the optimal usage of a hand and how it can manipulate objects and do things, and how important that is for our hands. So there's an optimal size for that, and you can't fall too far outside that range or it's not useful. Okay? But in terms of like a lot of sexually dimorphic characteristics, if they don't have to do with specifically like childbirth and things like that, oftentimes it comes down to the selection of whether or not the other sex likes it. Like, are larger hands on females desirable to males? Are larger hands on, or smaller hands on males desirable to females? And we see that a lot, like in different species. It's really weird. And we'll talk more about that later, but things like peacocks were disastrously confusing to Darwin at first. He didn't like the idea. Peacocks drove him crazy. Because why do you have all these big bright feathers on a bird? Like, it makes you edible. Like, everything looks at you and goes, I'm going to eat you. But it makes sense if you think of it in terms of the females like the males who have bright feathers. And suddenly, like, it's not a disadvantage anymore, is it? Because selection is based on both whether or not you reproduce and if you survive long enough to reproduce. So all those factors kind of come into play, but it's neat to see that we did get this sort of nice bell-shaped-ish curve. It's getting close anyway, for our hand data. So we have the average and we have outliers on either side. And we'll talk more about how these graphs actually relate to predictions that natural selection can make for us. Okay, should be able to fill that all out now.